Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Marina Itchel, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So this week, we're going to go right into our podcast with Steve Greenhut, who is Director of PRI's Free City Center. But for this podcast, Steve is Mr. Water. Steve is the author of PRI's book, Winning the Water Wars. So Californians were hit with record rains over the New Year's holiday and throughout much of January. So you live in one of the hardest hit areas from the storm in Wilton near Sacramento. You were even subject to mandatory evacuation. So tell us about your experience with the storm.
Yeah, I mean, we moved to an area that, low-lying area. Sacramento obviously is one of the most flood-prone metro areas, and we moved to one of the most flood-prone parts of that area. So it's not an unusual occurrence. We're a half mile from the Cosumnes River, which is the last undammed river in the state. So we're kind of dependent on the levees. And I never vote for tax increases, but I said I voted for the levy tax that they called for because, somebody's got to maintain these levees, and the water comes, we watch it online on they have a monitoring service, and the water, starts flowing out of the Sierra, and you get an estimate of where it's going to crest. And then everyone tries to do the best they can. My house was fine. I'm above the 100-year flood area, but the whole town, we were an island at one point. We really couldn't get out of town because the roads were blocked in every direction. And then Wilton was even on the national news with the massive flooding where the road I live on, where it hits the 99 freeway, was like a giant lake, and it consumed the freeway, and two people actually tragically drowned in their cars on the street I live in. So it was pretty bad. And then we evacuated after the power went out because we had this bad windstorm, and the lines went down and the power went out. And then that means we don't have water because we're on a well. So we hightailed it out of town for a few days. We were out of electricity, and a lot of people were out electricity for longer than that. So it was, from a personal standpoint, it was a mess. We saw an amazing number of trucks up and down the street, just one after another, big trucks with gravel from the different gravel pits and all this. I had heard that it was at least $2 million in levee work done. You'd drive over the river and this other creek, and they were patching these failing levees. So my public policy concern is, why aren't we maintaining these levees all year round? And that's one of my frustrations with California is, why don't we do stuff before? I mean, it's nice that they were working on the levees when they were breaking, but what are we doing the rest of the year? And we just have this massive infrastructure problem in the state. And I remember a few years ago, we all do, when the spillway was collapsing at Oroville, and almost 200,000 people were evacuated. And I have tenants up there, and it's just that the level. I think they spent $1 billion repairing those spillways. And the state does a poor job. We not only do not expand our infrastructure to meet growing needs, but we don't seem to maintain the infrastructure that we have, even when we have a $97.5 billion budget surplus. So that kind of infuriated me as we were sandbagging. We sandbagged all the doors, and my neighbors were sandbagging, and it was a really trying 3 weeks. I'll say that.
So many Californians, as part of this storm aftermath, experienced exceptionally long power outages during the storm and even in the days following. And they also saw, significant disruption of their internet and cable and telephone service. You had one of the worst experiences trying to get your internet service back working. Tell us about your experience and the lengths that you went through to get your service restored. And why do you think that the problem that you faced is ultimately a failure of a lack of free market choices in much of California for our utility providers?
Yeah, I think, we're in the SMUD electric district, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And one thing, it is obviously a monopoly electricity provider, but there was a SMUD truck everywhere. They got the electric going pretty quickly. A pole fell down in our front yard and they had it up and running. We were out of electric for about 3 days, and I don't begrudge them, but our Frontier internet service, I don't know that much about those systems, but I think it's broadband, and it's a monopoly. They're a monopoly provider. They're a regulated utility. And when we got back and we finally got the electric back and we got our water up and running, and things were at least back to normal. We didn't have internet, and living out here in a rural area, I'm dependent on that internet, for work, for everything anymore. Our houses are pretty much hooked up to Wi-Fi, television, music. I was getting pretty grumpy about it. So I called Frontier, and they told me it was that they wouldn't be out until February. So that would have been about 3 weeks after the outage, which is a pretty long time. And we have there's a Facebook page of our little local community, and people were reporting similar problems. One person I read wasn't going to be able to get anyone out there from Frontier till the end of February. And that, so this is the thing. In a competitive market, you go and you go to the competitor if the one company can't get its act together. And Frontier has monopolies in many parts of the country. In fact, I was reading that 83 million Americans have some sort of monopoly internet provider. So what do you do? So I called customer service, and they were very nice. And then they told me there wasn't anything they can do about it. And you'd call again and get frustrated. So in a monopoly system, you really don't have any choices. Now, there are some alternatives now. There are these wireless. I tried to get just practically speaking, I had a local wireless company come out and see if they could get me going, and they couldn't get a signal because of the tree cover. And that's a problem for a lot of people out here. So I was dependent on them. So what do you do? Well, it's a regulated system. So the only thing you can really do is either shame the company or go to regulators or lawmakers, right? I mean, that's just, that's the way. I wouldn't design a system that way, but that's how it was designed. And I kept stewing over it. So first I started trolling Frontier on Twitter and tweeting out little things, about, hey, remember the Ronald Reagan joke about when you could, in the Soviet Union, when you could get your Trabant, it's available in 12 years. Can you take delivery in the morning or the afternoon? So I was tweeting snarky things, and then Frontier would very, very politely, their customer service would contact me, and they'd direct message me, and they'd check into it, and they'd come back every time, and they said, it won't be until February. So I'm like, okay. I filed a complaint with the California Public Utilities Commission. I did some tweets to actual commissioners and to lawmakers. I emailed the county supervisor, and I emailed company executives. And anyway, long story short, I had people out there fixing my lines pretty quickly, and I got back and running. But the point is, one should not, in a competitive market system, one should not have to contact a state legislator or a county supervisor or a state commissioner to get your internet service back, right? It's just unfathomable to me but that's how regulated monopolies work. So that's your only recourse. And then, okay, I got mine back, but what about all the other people who don't have their service? So in a competitive system, we just choose, we have choices. So I shouldn't have to reform General Motors if I don't like the cars they make. I'll just buy a Ford or a Toyota. I shouldn't have to reform Frontier Communications, which is a large national company, which is, they've had a number of problems and issues. This is nothing. What I'm experiencing isn't unusual from what I've read. In a government control with government agencies or government granted monopolies, you're basically stuck trying to make a company or an agency operate better because we don't have any choice. So if the Department of Motor Vehicles isn't working efficiently, and how often does it work efficiently, although it has gotten better lately, I think. you're kind of at their mercy because you have to get a car registration and a license. And if you live in an area with one internet provider, a monopoly internet provider, you're kind of at their mercy. And that's a poor system. So I always advocate competition. The same thing with public schools. I mean, as Lance Azubi will tell you, I mean, it's crazy to have to try to reform your local school district. The answer is to be able to send your kids to a school that works for you. So competition is morally the best way. It helps everyone. And how many hours did I spend having to get my internet service back? It's crazy. And we all, and I'll just say, I'm not, I understand the fact that there was a widespread outage caused by floods and winds and other disasters. So we're all pretty tolerant about understanding that there are some problems that are beyond anyone's control. But at the same token, you have to hire the crews you need to get things back quickly as possible. I didn't get upset at all at SMUD because I saw that they were working on it. So you have to wait. Okay. But I didn't get the sense that, Frontier was acting as quickly as I think they ought to have.
So, Steve, after the storms, our discussion of water policy turned overnight from being dominated by drought to being dominated by floods. Many of these issues you talked about in your great book of Winning the Water Wars is now coming to fruition now that the immediate storm emergency has subsided. Let's talk about some of these issues. First, about flood preparation and emergency management efforts. What grade do you give to state and local officials for how they prepared for and responded to the storm and why?
Well, I don't give our state very good grades for these things in general. I mean, in the past, we have the state of California has basically turned its system of rivers into a giant plumbing system, right? And during the Great Flood of 1862, when Governor Leland Stanford had to row his own boat to his inauguration, there was a lake, I believe it was like 300 miles long and 20 miles wide through the Central Valley. So I think we need to start by recognizing that the system of reservoirs and canals that previous generations built here in California not only provided water so that nearly 40 million people can live productive lives, but it also minimized some of these flood conditions. And I had a quote from Joan Didion in my book. I don't have it right in front of me, but basically she said it's always been this way in California. You have the choking of the empty pipes during droughts and the levee watches during floods. It's not unusual. Climate change may be exacerbating it, but the evidence suggests that this is the way it's always been. So what the state needs to do is build resilience into the system so that it can deal with whatever Mother Nature throws our way. And we're just terrible at planning ahead. And I had mentioned the Oroville situation before. It shouldn't take a near crumbling of the spillways before the state decides to do anything. Like any sort of infrastructure, any buildings we own, we need to be preparing in advance and maintaining those things. And the state just does a terrible job doing that. So, Governor Newsom, a few months ago announced a water resiliency plan, which is actually a good plan. Now, I don't know whether he's actually going to do anything about it, but it was the first time in ages that I remember a governor talking about the need for more infrastructure building. But we talk about these things, but the bureaucracy is so intense that we just never get around to fixing things. And that's my biggest beef with California. I mean, we all accept the fact that there are a lot of inefficiencies here, that we have high tax rates. We have a lot of things that we would prefer didn't exist. But the fact that the state likes to focus on these big things, right? They're going to change the entire globe's climate at the same time that they can't assure that there's a reliable electricity system. We all remember not that long ago when the ISO was warning people to not charge their electric vehicles at the same time, the same week that the state was boasting about its efforts to eliminate internal combustion engines. So my frustration is our state is really good about talking about grandiose things, but not good at all about maintaining the nuts and bolts of government, the things that even as free market people, we accept that there's a role for government in infrastructure. And yet we just don't build the infrastructure. We don't maintain the infrastructure. We don't plan ahead. I still remember when Governor Gray Davis announcing essentially that the era of freeway building is over. Well, you know what? People are still driving. And at that time, the population was still growing. We need to think more about tending to the services that people rely on. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of people move to states like Texas. They're building and planning for the future. They're planning for growth. And we're in this kind of mode of scaling back. And, you stop building freeways, but people keep driving. That just creates misery. Same thing with water. We haven't built major water infrastructure since the 1970s when the population was roughly half its size. So what do you think is going to happen? We're going to have drought conditions are always going to hit. And then we don't have enough water. And then we end up with rationing or extreme conservation. Again, nothing against conservation. That's good. But Californians are conserving. Westerners are conserving. I did a show related to the book in Arizona where I found the stat that Arizona uses less water than it did in the late 1950s when the population was 1/7 of its current size. So people are conserving, but the state isn't doing its job.
So in hindsight, do you think that the state was ultimately prepared for a series of storms like this? As you mentioned, Sacramento, for example, has been rated as being really in the range of New Orleans as far as its flood control preparation. And, we certainly saw some pretty damaging flooding, and certainly in your neck of the woods and also in the Napa area and the Santa Barbara area. So do you think we will now see an expediting of projects or even new initiatives undertaken, after we've seen just how on the brink the Sacramento region and other parts of the state really are when it comes to flooding?
I would like to think that this will prompt our leaders to take these issues more seriously. I mean, the levees, throughout the Delta. I mean, Tim, you live in this area, and you go through the Delta. Those levees, those are old levees, right? And I just don't see, though, that they're going to do it. For what always happens, I remember when Governor Brown announced the end of the previous drought, and it was just back to business as usual, focusing our resources on expanding social programs and climate change agenda. And it's just really hard to get the state focused on these nuts and bolts. So I hope somebody's paying attention, but I'm not really that hopeful, not just because I'm a nattering nabob, but because I just haven't seen evidence since I've been in California. It's been nearly 25 years that there's a lot of planning going into these basic infrastructure questions. So what happened after the last drought ended, it started raining again. So then it's just back to business as usual. So it's raining. Fortunately, it's done now for a little while, and the reservoirs are filling up. The Sierra snowpack is above seasonal averages. Less of the state is in a drought than before. I'm fearful as the new legislature starts that we're just gonna go back to business as usual. Republicans are trying to draw attention to it, but they don't have a lot of power in Sacramento. And then whenever we do infrastructure, water related bills, most of that money usually ends up going to conservation, goes to habitat restoration. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but sometimes you just have to build infrastructure. There have been projects on the books since the Eisenhower era that haven't been built, and so I'm not that hopeful. We just swing back and forth between droughts and floods. And I don't see a lot of reason for hope right now, but we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see what the governor and the legislature announce.
So aside from the loss of life and damage to people's homes, businesses, and properties, we've been flushing out much of the water that could have been saved if we had built additional above ground water storage capacity for the state's needs. So in your view, what are the roadblocks holding up construction of key storage projects both Democrats and Republicans could agree upon? And are these projects even could these projects have secured the funding necessary to complete them, which is usually the key holdup in building these projects?
Yeah, I was reading about I think it was SB1, which was the water bond, and that took an awful lot of effort to get a water bond that actually focused money on infrastructure. And but a lot of that money, I go over it in the book. A lot of that money was earmarked for smaller projects. And some of the money that was earmarked, it needed matching funds from locals, and it wasn't enough money to assure that the projects would succeed. I think that Sites Reservoir actually it's an off-stream reservoir, Sacramento Valley. I think that's proceeding, but specifically, yeah, there are all these bureaucratic hurdles. There are so many agencies involved, and the state moves at a snail's pace to build things anymore. So there's that problem. It's been 8 years. I mean, and I was just reading one article today that was talking about how there's been very little progress made on these projects in 8 years. State officials say they're making progress, but it just takes forever to get anything done. But as I point out in the book, I think the bigger problem is the mentality. There's this the environmentalists have quite a bit of power. The state officials, they don't really want to build infrastructure for a growing population. At least that's my sense, that they're more concerned about environmental issues, and they seem to have a lot of zeal for projects like eliminating the dams on the Klamath River, things that restore rivers to their wild habitat. That gets a lot more energy than projects that want to store more water. So obviously, if you have bigger reservoirs and more reservoirs, you can store more water when we do get these rainy events. And I've had environmentalists take issue with me. They say something to the effect of, well, what good are more reservoirs when it's so dry, there's no water in any of them? I'm like, that's true, but only if it doesn't rain again. And it has rained again. So if we trap more water, we will. If you have more buckets, you have more water. So that's pretty much it. And the whole theme of my book was the need to promote abundance rather than to manage scarcity. And the mentality is we're stuck in this managing scarcity. And that's why we're not getting things done, because it's amazing. It's amazing how quickly a project will get built when state officials really want it to get built.
Steve, PRI's CEQA Gauntlet research project showed that California's environmental laws are adding expense and delay not only to housing construction, but also climate change projects and wildfire prevention efforts. So from your view, what role has CEQA and these legal roadblocks played in throwing a wrench in our efforts for expanded water storage and flood control projects?
CEQA is always an obstacle. The California Environmental Quality Act. But when Darrell Steinberg wanted a arena for the Kings basketball team in Sacramento, the legislature quickly eliminated the CEQA standards and it got built. If they had that mentality towards water projects, I think even California could build them. But we just have to change our thinking. And we're not talking about damming new rivers. I mean, we're talking about off-stream reservoirs, better groundwater storage, desalination plants. There was a project in the Mojave Desert that would have tapped an aquifer the size of Rhode Island. That was a private project, but the state and U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein intervened to stop that project. And we're going to solve the water problem around the margins, not with one big easy button solution. And so the California Coastal Commission unanimously rejected a desalination plan, a privately funded one in Huntington Beach that was almost identical to the one down the road in San Diego County that meets 12% of the water needs of a county of well over 3 million people. That's a pretty big piece of the puzzle. So if you do a lot of those things, we can solve the water problem, but you have to really want to do that and my column in the Register last weekend was about how a lot of environmentalists seem intent on making us miserable rather than actually practically addressing, environmental resource problems. And I think there's too much of that mentality, and that's got to shift before we're able to do anything. Beyond CEQA, and CEQA, of course, is always a problem because it gives basically anyone standing to file lawsuits, which dramatically delay all sorts of projects ranging from housing to water. But in the water world, the Department of Water Resources has a 52-page booklet, whatever, explaining the water trading process. And there's a decision, the water trading decision tree I published in Winning the Water Wars, and it's like a Rube Goldberg cartoon, right? All the many weird steps before, and the agencies that have to prove it, and you have to prove beneficial use for a trade. So while the state allows water trading, trading doesn't happen very much. And PPIC did a report showing the importance of water trading because it enables farms in the Imperial Valley, instead of using the water to grow alfalfa, they could send some of it to San Diego where it's desperately needed. So water trading is another example of something that could help around the margins. It could add a few percentage points of the amount of water we have available. So, and I quote Sally Pipes, PRI president, had talked about how water, for a state that's so excited about its technological prowess, we don't have a lot of technological advancement in pricing. And which is a precursor to good water trading. So there's a lot that we can do. There are a lot of regulatory obstacles that need to be analyzed beyond CEQA, but CEQA, of course, is the best known obstacle.
So, Steve, looking ahead to this year's legislative session, now that water is once again at the forefront of the public consciousness, what, if anything, do you think the legislature will do this year to address our water challenges? And based on the recommendations from your book, Winning the Water Wars, what should be the priority for state and local officials wanting to get these critical projects done?
Yeah, I'm watching. The legislative council deadline was on Friday, and I'm looking at the bills that are starting to drop. And I haven't seen any major water bills yet. And I've heard Republicans talking about the need to do it. So I think we need to prioritize some infrastructure spending, expanding, getting Sites Reservoir finished. Water recycling is something that Orange County does particularly well, and that should be expanded to wherever it's geographically appropriate. It depends on the groundwater basins and so forth. But that's something that I know the state had expressed an interest in expanding. Environmentalists like that of water recycling, and it's less costly in Orange County than importing water. I've been promoting an idea to study that water trading system and see if there are ways to streamline the regulations so that we can do water trading. The problem with water is it's such a big and costly issue, and now we're facing a budget deficit. I had argued that during the time that rare massive budget surplus, that was the time to get ahead on a lot of the state's financial problems, pension liabilities, to get ahead on, we had the excess money that we could have taken a look at our tax system and reformed it in a way that made us less dependent on these boom and bust cycles. And also we had the money to make a serious dent in our water infrastructure problems. So we could have diverted a lot more money to upgrading and maintaining infrastructure, looking at projects. There was one plan that would have increased the size of Shasta Dam by 11 feet. It was designed to be much taller than that even. And I just don't see those type of big thinking proposals coming. So I'm going to stay, watch closely and see what kind of water bills get introduced. But again, I'm not that hopeful in a world of budget deficits. And the governor's budget proposal seems to want to continue and even step up spending on his some of his progressive priorities and their climate change agenda and some of the social spending. And of course, legislators, they talk about, wanting to move to a single payer system. And that's the kind of stuff that's on their mind. And I'm not expecting a lot, but I'm going to look real carefully at what starts coming. I think the deadline for introducing legislation is actually the 16th of February.
So in winning the water wars, you write that policymakers should really be focused on water through a policy lens of promoting abundance rather than scarcity. And many have made the case that our drought and our other water problems are really politician created rather than being caused by Mother Nature. So now that we're hopefully on the backside of these tremendous storms, do you think that we'll see any change in how water policymakers approach these issues?
As I mentioned before, I'm not that hopeful that we're going to see change, but I did think that the governor's water proposal, it did call for desalination. It did call for building and expanding infrastructure. That's welcome. But the wheels of progress through our bureaucracies move so slowly, and you would think that after a particularly severe drought and then particularly severe flood events, that it would focus the attention of the legislature on these basic infrastructure issues. But they are politician-created problems. Obviously, the climate will do what it's going to do, and California will have floods and droughts. There isn't much that we can do about Mother Nature, but we can, build resiliency rather than trying to enact policies that kind of nudge the rest of the world to try to address climate change. We need to be embracing policies that make our state more resilient if the climate is changing, and to deal with whatever we have. So, but that's what we need to do, and we don't have a competitive political system. So I don't know how we're gonna change the trajectory. Now the state did pass SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which attempts to regulate groundwater, which is a totally defensible law because it's a tragedy of the commons situation where the water underground, you're incentivized to use as much of it as possible because there's nothing to compel you to save for the future, because if you don't use the water, if you're a big farm and you don't use the water, somebody else will. So I guess the farms with the biggest pumps get the most water. So, but the problem with that, there was a study that I cited in my book that pointed to the amount of fallowed farm fields that we're going to have because of that. And SGMA needed to be passed against the backdrop of finding ways to get water to parts of the state, especially parts of the San Joaquin Valley, like in Kings County, that don't have access to water. So we need farms. We need the food that they provide. The San Joaquin Valley's the most fabulous farmland in the country, perhaps the world. The variety of crops, and I'd like to see the farmers become more vocal. I just drove down through the valley down to Los Angeles, and you see the signs on the farms admonishing the governor and talking about the need to store more and to dam more water, to provide more water through dams and canals. But I've seen those signs for years, and I don't know what it's going to take to get policymakers to start taking those concerns seriously. That doesn't mean that, farm water can't be used more efficiently. That's why I'm so big into water trading and proper pricing. As the statistic I used in the book, 50% of the state's water is for environmental uses. It flows out to the Pacific. 40% is for ag, and only 10% is for urban water uses. So if we end up back where we were, which is in rationing water for cities and for residences, we're only looking at 10% of the water. So even if we slash that, it doesn't come near the amount that's used for the environment. And we have to keep water in the rivers, obviously, but we can take more of it out, and we could store more of it during flood years. And during this recent flood, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but an incredible amount of water just flowed out to the Pacific that could have been saved to get us through periods of drought. And I know in the Southland, they're talking more of stormwater capture. That's expensive, but all that water that just flowed out the concrete rivers right into the Pacific, we can be storing more of that water. And so you store more water in wet years, and then you have it in dry years. It's the basics.
So, Steve, finally, a big picture question. So on water and so many other issues, we find ourselves always asking, what is it going to take for Californians to finally demand action from a legislature that's very good about doing nothing? So as we close, we put that question to you. Now that we've endured massive rains and have flushed out lots of water into the sea that could have been stored, what is it going to take to finally turn things around and get positive results in building storage and other critical water projects that have strong support across the political spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a political activist, but at some point in our democratic system, these are political questions, and more pressure from local officials and from water districts and from farm interests, and we just need. I don't think we're going to change, and I don't advocate for, one sort of political solution or another as far as elections, but definitely need more people from whatever party promoting water abundance. And I think one of the things like we do here at PRI is we come up with ideas. And you promote the ideas, and you promote the blueprint. I mean, we did that book, Saving California, and we come up with answers to some of these problems. And of course, they almost always get ignored. But at some point, the politicians will be pushed by the public to muster the political will, and then the solutions will be there for those who want them. So there's no real easy way to achieve this. It's just that the public needs to be clear that they want their politicians to first and foremost deal with the nuts and bolts of government, to make sure that we have electricity, roads, water, all the things that create the backdrop for a booming economy and for a healthy lifestyle. And at some point, things could reach a head where politicians might listen, and that's about all we can do. Is we create at the think tanks, we create ideas. The public provides pressure, and at some point, just hope that the right people start listening.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.